The government is full of secrets, and that is exactly why we are back with a part 2 of the top 10 government secrets that were accidentally leaked. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have cat drop. Apparently, the United States Office of Strategic Services, once upon a time, decided that the very best and most sensical way to ensure that bombs that had been dropped reached their intended naval targets was to strap them to cats and then drop them from planes. I know, it's absolutely horrific. It's definitely not my plan. They thought up this strange project because for some reason they thought that the cats would just be able to avoid the water and instead direct themselves to the target. Strange in theory, catastrophic in reality. No pun intended. There of course is no way to prevent these animals from fainting midair, and if you were dropped from a plane suddenly with no parachute and a bomb strapped to you, you'd probably also faint, because what in the actual hell? Definitely one for the history books that we can all be thankful this is not something that carried on for very long. In our number 9 spot today we have Operation Popeye. This is a program that was aimed at trying to control or modify the weather. It was a military cloud seeding operation that was carried out by the United States Air Force during the Vietnam War between 1967 and 1972. Basically, they wanted to figure out a way to use the weather to their advantage. They wanted to try and extend monsoon season over certain areas of Vietnam so as to sort of disrupt the Vietnamese military. This would make it harder for supplies to be delivered, it would cause landslides, it would definitely just be a hindrance. Starting on March 20th, 1967 and continuing through every rainy season, this cloud seeding operation went on for years until all rain-making operations ceased on July 5th, 1972. This was of course a mostly classified mission for quite a while, and it took a while for the public to really be aware of what exactly was going on. But it likely isn't a coincidence that the operation stopped just 2 days after there was a publication about it in the New York Times. This led for there to be demands for laws to be passed about this kind of weather modification because it was quite an unprecedented tactic at the time. In our number 8 spot today we have Unit 731. The Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 731 conducted some pretty horrifying experiments during World War II that certainly are shocking to anyone who learns about them. The experiments were meant to be done as a way to prepare for biological warfare, but the process was gruesome and extremely inhumane. Different medical schools and universities provided doctors and other research staff to help conduct these experiments, and they used both prisoners and civilians as the guinea pigs for them. There were a bunch of different experiments that were conducted during this time, some of which involved injecting them with pathogens such as plague or cholera or anthrax. Others involved vivisection or operations with no anesthesia, putting them in a pressure chamber to see how much a human can withstand before bursting, or even live weapons testing. It is hard to believe that this was a real thing that happened, and we honestly can't even begin to imagine what those people were forced to face during that time. After World War II, however, the United States gave immunity to Shiro Ishii, who was the Japanese Army medical officer responsible for lethal human experimentation and biological warfare projects. Many of these experiments he conducted just to see what would happen. American scientists decided that this information would be valuable, so they decided to give him immunity in exchange for the information on chemical and biological warfare. Shiro was never tried for his crimes. In our number 7 spot today we have Project Acoustic Kitty. Apparently in 1967 the CIA was spending millions of dollars trying to make cats into spies. I don't know what it is with the government and cats, or why they chose the one animal that literally does not care what you want it to do, but alas, they did, and Project Acoustic Kitty was born. The project basically involved implanting electronic spy equipment into real living cats, who would then be trained to basically eavesdrop on unsuspecting people. This was a Cold War era plan that was intended to be used on those in the Soviet Union. The project had a whole slew of issues, of course, because cats get hungry and distracted, and unfortunately the first time this plan was being tested, there was a horrible outcome. It just did not go to plan. The project of course was cancelled, and the researchers said that they believed they could train cats to move short distances, but that, quote, the environmental and security factors in using this technique in a real foreign situation force us to conclude that for our intelligence purposes, it would not be practical. In our number 6 spot today we have the Dreyfus Affair. In 1984, France's government and their army were in some hot water for a series of scandals that had recently happened when a janitor discovered papers that revealed just another scandal to add to the list. This janitor had found the papers in a garbage bin of a German military ambassador that revealed that there was a French officer who had turned against them and who was spying on the Germans. When this came to light, they needed a way out of the mess, so they decided to use a scapegoat, a man named Alfred Dreyfus. Alfred was a Jewish officer in the French army, and they decided to accuse him of this spying and selling of secrets. His trial was huge in the media, and he ended up being sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island, and hateful and prejudiced groups used him as an example of a quote, unpatriotic Jewish person. Later, the chief of military intelligence would uncover evidence that proved who the real spying culprit was, but when this happened, the chief of military intelligence was removed from his position by his superiors to try and keep the secret from getting out. It is said that French authorities tried to suppress these accusations, but a novelist named Émile Zola continued to accuse the army of a cover-up. People were torn at this point. Some people swear that Alfred was still to blame, while others were convinced he was innocent. In the end, the fight really became more about principle rather than whether or not Alfred was really innocent. There were 12 years of controversy surrounding this case until Major Hubert Joseph Henry ended up admitting to forging the key documents before taking his own life. The case was finally reopened, and while Alfred was found guilty again, he soon received a pardon from the president. A few years after this, a civilian court of appeals found Alfred innocent, and he went on to have quite an army career, and he even fought with honor in the First World War. This was a scandal that really did change French politics forever. In our number 5 spot today, we have Prohibition Poisoning. You likely already know about the Prohibition era, but if not, this was a time period where there were restrictions placed on the consumption of alcohol, which was done with a ban being placed on the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcohol by the US government from 1920 to 1933. Also, if you want to know more about this time, we have whole videos on it, so make sure you check those out once you're done here, okay? In knowing about the Prohibition comes the knowledge that this ban certainly did not stop people from producing or consuming alcohol. It was just done in sneakier ways. The black market for alcohol was booming as people began to drink redistilled industrial alcohol instead. This is all pretty well known, but one super sketchy thing that is definitely less well known is something that government agencies did to curb the black market sales of alcohol. Basically, they poisoned the industrial alcohol that was being repurposed for drinking. And not just poisoned in a way where like the drinker would get sick or it wouldn't taste good, which is already, you know, kind of sketchy, but they poisoned the alcohol with lethal chemicals. It is thought that by the time the Prohibition ended, at least 10,000 people died from this. This event is still one of the strangest and deadliest decisions made by government officials. In our number 4 spot today, we have the Pentagon Papers. In June of 1971, the New York Times published a few different excerpts that were taken from a top secret Department of Defense report that pertained to the United States and their involvement in the Vietnam War from 1945 to 1967. These papers were created as a part of a study by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and the reason they were so important and secret is because they revealed that 4 consecutive presidential administrations had lied to and misled both Congress as well as the American people about the involvement in the war. Daniel Ellsberg, who is said to have been a military analyst who opposed the war, leaked these confidential government records, and him as well as the New York Times and the Washington Post all faced criminal charges in court for their efforts to get the papers into public knowledge, but in a turn of events, the charges were later dismissed. Not only were these papers important, but the leak was a crucial moment in time because it bred major distrust in the United States government that would only go on to grow. In our number 3 spot today, we have Operation Midnight Climax. This experiment took place in the 1950s, and it was one of those mind control research projects that was sponsored by the CIA. This was actually just one experiment that was a part of Project MK Ultra, which maybe if there's a part 3, we'll talk more about MK Ultra. So basically, they just wanted to study the effects of LSD, but instead of finding willing participants, which probably wouldn't have really been that difficult, instead they used non-consenting people who were lured to safe houses by sex workers who were being paid by the CIA, and then once they were at these safe houses, they were slipped the little sneaky substance and monitored from behind a one-way glass. For over a decade, the project gave the government more knowledge about the substance itself and what it does to the mind. It gave the knowledge about surveillance technology and even sexual blackmail. In the the end, the project was shut down in 1965 because, slipping people substances is not a good look for the government. Who would have thought? Not them, I guess. In our number 2 spot today, we have Project Minaret. This is a document that became declassified in 2013 as a part of the National Security Archives efforts. This historical document describes a sort of watch list of prominent Americans who were critical of the Vietnam War. The document explains that their overseas communications were tapped and listened into by the government from 1967 to 1973, and a quote from the document reads, quote, "President Johnson wanted to know if the domestic anti-war movement was receiving help from abroad." The project expanded so much that it went on to include more than 1,600 people, including civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Whitney Young, and Muhammad Ali. There were also people like Democratic U.S. Senator Frank Church of Idaho, Republican Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee, a New York Times columnist named Tom Wicker, and a Washington Post humor columnist named Art Buchwald. The surveillance began under President Johnson, but it continued on through to the Nixon administration. In the end, the only reason it was stopped was because Attorney General Elliot Richardson was concerned about its very doubtful and murky legality and decided during the Watergate scandal that it would be best to shut it down. I mean, they definitely had enough on their plate to worry about at the time. In our number 1 spot today, we have Project 1794. This project was created with the goal to build a sort of saucer-type aircraft that would be designed to shoot down Soviet bombers. The program, which was created in the 1950s, was quite ambitious and had some pretty lofty goals. A team of engineers began trying to build a disc-shaped aircraft, but here's the real kicker. They wanted it to be capable of traveling at supersonic speeds at high altitudes. The document about this project shows that they wanted it to be able to travel at Mach 4, which is 4 times the speed of sound, and they wanted it to be able to reach an altitude of over 100,000 feet. At the time, the project was estimated to cost about $3 million, which is around $26 million in today's money, and in the end, the project was cancelled in 1961 because the craft failed tests and proved to be aerodynamically unstable, which of course would provide a whole slew of problems at high speeds, especially supersonic ones. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I will see you again very soon. Bye!